Greetings to you, everybody. Eric McCool here of Permagora Live, coming at you today on October 15th. We're going to look at a concept today called the Totalitarian Tiptoe, and we're going to look at it in graph form. I've mapped it out. This is for the history of the United States, and it is just to look at how over time those who wish to have total control over pretty much everything, political conspirators, tyrants, they have been consolidating their power and playing a very long, slow game. They've tiptoed towards their eventual goal of global domination. And they've done so through various entities, mostly government, some of them corporate, but they've done this through the normalization of practices that would then later become integral to the fabric of the system that they want to create. So I'm going to scoot over here, and we're going to look at the Totalitarian Tiptoe. I believe that concept was coined by David Icke, and it's great. It's very, very fitting. Over here we have the level of government encroachment, total freedom being in the green down here, and you'll notice that where I started this timeline, sort of at the founding of the United States, it's never even there. There was never total freedom. There was always forced taxation. There was always conscription into the army. There's always violation of consent, and total freedom is something that's really only ever historically been awarded to people who can live self-sufficiently outside of society, as far as I can tell. So, at that time, there were various federal taxes. As I said, there was conscription. There was lots of things that weren't great. But I mean, otherwise, across the board, you want to buy land, you can buy land. You're not paying property taxes on your land. You're not paying for any kind of licensing. You're not asking the government for permission to do very much back then. You were very free. Of course, you were also pretty much on your own. You didn't have help in a lot of things, and so kind of came with the territory. But by the end of the 18th century, we start looking at federal property taxes. The government saying, look, you own land, give us money. Pay up. In that time period, there were a variety of things that were going on that were established. There was all these attempts to create the central banks that Andrew Jackson fought, and that there were attempts by more European continental powers to make sure that this new country, this United States experiment or catastrophe, as far as they were concerned, didn't get too far out of hand and remained more or less in the control of their agents and their agendas. And that's something to realize, is that the United States was always at war with Britain. It's not that we ever really became at peace with them again. It's that essentially they got enough control of our internal workings to have us follow along with whatever they wanted to do. Getting us entering into the world wars was really the beginning of that. But anyway, I digress. We're going to talk about things these are landmarks of the erosion of our freedom. These are things that happened that I think made big steps, or big, they're not big, they're tiptoes in a way, but, as they tiptoe normally, sometimes they take a full stride, and that's what a lot of these incidents are. For instance, revenue tax, which was a precursor to the income tax, but that began Civil War era, and this officially only lasted for those 11 years, but essentially they were already experimenting with ways to start taking money from the wages and from the earnings that people had. And another big step was during that time period, or a little after, 1875 to 1900, was a big leap towards business licensing, making people pay the government money just to operate a business, making them ask for permission. If they don't, you can legally shut them down, you can arrest them, you can fine them, you can confiscate their property. These are euphemisms for you can physically harm and hurt someone who doesn't just give you money when you say so. This is why we say taxation is theft. It is a crime to force people to pay money to you just because you think you need the money, just because you have a fancy document with a seal. But they normalized it. They got people to think, I guess this is all the government. They're in charge, right? They want you to believe that. 1913, big jump. Really should be right at the cusp of government domination from government encroachment. Like this is the Federal Reserve Act, and with it the income tax, an official, legitimate of course, I say legitimate. There technically is no law, but this created the precedence for what they would later use to strong arm you into paying taxes, to trick you into thinking you have to. And so, yeah, and that also is the beginning of the World War era and all sorts of encroachments. I mean, think about, I won't get into the espionage sort of stuff. That comes really more later, but just think about how much the world changed because of that war, and how much more people were willing to sacrifice freedom for security after they were traumatized by the death of so many millions of people. They felt like the world needed to crack down on things that led to bad things. And that's what gets us into criminalization of drugs, right? This was really the 1920s and the 1930s. Big movements were made to essentially give the police and the government another reason to lock you up and put you into the criminal court system, right? Drugs are not a crime. There's no crime involved unless you're forcibly giving them to other people. There's no victim. Drugs are just something that exists. And they sell them at the grocery store. And they have, there's all sorts of definitions and all sorts of that. But this was a mental, conceptual leap for them to get the public to start to normalize this notion that drugs are bad, okay? Like, if you see someone getting arrested for drugs, it's not a kidnapping, it's not an abduction, it's not a crime against that person, it's just them getting arrested for doing something bad. That was something they had to implant in your head. Because back in these days, if they tried to arrest you for that, it wouldn't be legitimate. There is no crime. The drug wars really associated non-violent offenses with criminal behavior and tricked the world into accepting tyranny because they thought it was keeping them safe, keeping their kids safe. Another thing during that time period, or later a little bit, the 1930s and 1950s, we get introduction of driver's licenses. And I should say that there were various forms of licensing for driving and examples of it earlier, but this was when it really became widespread. I think by the 50s was when the last state required it. This was usually done state by state, but still, same thing. Passports, similar with World War I or II. World War II, they start making you have a passport to travel to other countries. Basically, they say you don't like it, move to another country. You can't. You have to ask for permission to leave. It's the same thing with Nazi Germany, same thing with the Soviet states and East Germany after World War II. They want you to come to them for permission for everything. That's what tyranny is, okay? It's when you don't get to do anything you want without getting a permission slip, and where there's people watching you all the time. So, in this time period of the 50s and 60s, there's a huge implementation of business licensing. Same thing. You want to make money? You got to pay us. And it's not just the licensing, it's the regulation and controls over businesses. All done on the premise that they're trying to keep people safe, right? They don't want you serving food that'll make you sick. They come up with regulatory agencies, which aren't in and of themselves as a concept a terrible thing. But what it comes down to is who controls them and what exactly are the rules that we're going to have them regulate. Who gets to make those rules? And essentially not the people whose businesses were affected, not the people who are now having to pay more and more of their income to the government. Along with their income tax, their business is paying more of its income to the government because they have to jump through all these hoops to even be legal to operate. So this was a big move, and it took place over many years. Now, this is a big jump, and this definitely got us into a whole new category of risk threat when there was a coup against our country, at least against the president of the country in '63 when they killed Kennedy, and that assassination paved the way for the Vietnam War and for the normalization of endless wars. Military-industrial complex, welfare state, right? These people are just draining our budget and taking all of our money and using it to murder innocent people, and they're normalizing that. That's part of the tiptoe. They didn't just get into Vietnam quickly. They were in Vietnam. Well, I won't even go into when they get in there, when they started there, because that's a whole other conversation, and I want to do it as a quiz to see how many of y'all even know. But before Kennedy, they didn't have a lot of people on the ground there. They were mostly just support for this new government of South Vietnam. They were trying to use it as a proxy, but they couldn't actually be there. Kennedy was trying to pull out. That's the reason he got assassinated. He was going to end the war, among other things, and so they popped him. And once he was dead, they escalated the war, and that's when it really began as we know it, as being this, decade-long conflict. It was really much longer. But the endless war, the create the normalization. This ties into the drug war. It also normalized the drug war wasn't just about making drugs illegal. It was also about getting everybody addicted to them. It was really important. Same thing with the crack thing in the ghettos and with opium wars in China. It gives the government a legal excuse to go after more and more people, and it ruins their lives. And it ruined the lives of a lot of the vets that they ended up on all sorts of drugs over in Vietnam. In fact, one of my uncles told me that he was like, yeah, you were high all the time. It's either you'd be scared shitless or you just get high on what there is and you just get through it, you know? And that was just sort of the reality that so many of them were faced with. And when they came back, they were much more prone to actual like drug addiction and to having their lives torn apart by not only the trauma they lived through, but the drugs that they were trying to use to cope with the trauma that were actually also destroying them. It was a very sinister strategy. And there's plenty of research that proves that all of this was a strategy. It wasn't by accident that so many people got addicted to opiates and heroin in Vietnam. They were actually producing it over there, and the military was shipping it out. The CIA was shipping it out. Which, by the way, that reminds me, I missed a section here. 1945, creation of the OSS, the CIA. OSS was the precursor. And the rise of the intelligent industrial complex. That's a big aspect which led to Kennedy's assassination in the Vietnam War. It was essentially a coup. Instead of the government being run by the people who traditionally ran it, who were politicians like legislators or executive branch people, now the government is run from behind the scenes by these roundtables of intelligence and military culture. And these people have a whole different agenda that they keep secret. These are cultures of secrecy, right? They don't let you know what they're up to. It's none of our business, they're telling us. And they're trying to run our country. They got control of it after Kennedy, haven't had a independent president since, with the exception of possibly Trump, but that one's still, the verdict's still out on that. 1971, big jump for tyranny, taking our money off the gold standard. This basically began the end of the dollar. As soon as they did that, it's like, and it also allowed all of these other shenanigans that went on in the 70s and 80s and 90s, which I just sort of generalize as overthrows, basically coups against dictators or whatever, against governments that in Central America and Asia and Africa that we didn't like, and implanting people we do like, and using guns and drugs and all that to do that. That was all going on, coming from this and largely coming from this. Now they have an endless checkbook. They can just write the checks as much as they want. They can flood the money into the world, flood the economies of the world with this money that is as cheap as the paper it's printed on and cost them nothing. And that was a big deal, and that's something that kind of just came and went, and people didn't maybe realize how big of an event it was when it happened. I know Robert Kiyosaki figured it out because I saw him at a conference, and he talked about how when he found out that gold was going off the gold standard, he was actually in Vietnam, and he started going around and buying it from all the locals who had it. And he laughed and made a joke about how he tried to offer some greenbacks, some American dollars, and she was like wanted a certain amount. She wasn't just going to take a few dollars thinking that's worth something compared to this gold. And he laughed about how he said she knew more about the economy than he did. She knew more about economics than he did. Some person who's probably not even literate in a village in the jungle knew what gold was for and what it means in economics. And anyhow, that was a big thing that people just sort of didn't even notice. Or when I was growing up, it was never talked about. They didn't ever really teach me what that meant and what our dollars now are, now that they're not on the gold standard. So yeah, that was a period of seemingly economic growth in the country, but also incremental implementation of tyrannical things, like the continuation of the drug war. And there were beginnings, this is kind of the beginning of the freedom of speech restrictions in this country, where there's more censorship taking place. Journalists who were catching on to this stuff were being murdered. And so the tyranny was getting a little more overt, but also written off as, oh, you're just a conspiracy theorist if you believe any of that stuff. I mean, even the assassination of Kennedy, it's that was sloppy. But then we get into 2003, Patriot Act and the Wars of Terror, which really 2001, I didn't put that on here as a jump to the totalitarian tiptoe. I probably should have, but essentially I put it all in here with this. The totalitarianism that would result from the attack on New York that was conducted by these intelligence communities and their proxies, that was not really, that was the shock that brought it available, made it possible, but the tyranny all kind of came later. The TSA and the Homeland Security and all of that. And so that was a big jump, and I couldn't quite get this to scale, but I would say that one took us up there to the very top of soft tyranny, to where we're not really in a safe zone anymore. But it wasn't quite overt because there was still a lot of freedoms that we had, and it, if you think about how much more free you feel today versus 2005, just think about that. Like, think about what the internet was in 2005 and how much more free it was and how much more free all of us were. I didn't include this in here, but the introduction of social media technology and handheld internet basically enslaved what was left of the free human impulse of the greater parts of the 20th century, when people had that sort of like, anyone can do it, you have opportunity, you can work hard. That whole mentality sort of ended at the beginning of the 21st century. And then it continued into 2008 with the bailouts. That was another really, really big jump, where basically they normalized giving away more of our money, all that was already stolen or taken without consent, and giving it to these really, really rich people who are just getting richer and richer, while most people lower down on the strata are getting poorer, right? And of course, the NDAA, a lot of the drone programs, a lot of the suppression of Occupy Wall Street, that was all kind of this era of Obama and the nice smiling face on tyranny. Someone who sure made a lot of people in this country think that things were turning around and getting better, while behind the scenes, all sorts of heinous war crimes were taking place, and all sorts of corruption, and all sorts of lies. And now all that's coming out, and we can see now what a big step that was into overt tyranny, which I really think around that era, we started crossing into there. And through censorship, through what became known as trial by public opinion, and just sort of a war against independent thought and people who question things, and lots of assassinations of those sorts of people, the arrest of Julian Assange, the exile of Edward Snowden, the Bradley or Chelsea Manning case, like that whole reality was the end of our freedom. And many of us were saying that at the time and being laughed at. And now, of course, we're here in 2020, and I just put lockdowns. I could add about 50 more words to that to give you an example of the tyranny of this age. But we all know what's going on. I don't think anyone's going to argue with me anymore about the reek of totalitarian political agendas here that just permeates our daily lives now. And I think that we want this curve to drop off immediately. We want to get out of this zone, and we don't want to live there. I think as much as people would perhaps argue with me about whether or not that's where we're going and that's what's happening right now, I know that they're not going to argue with me about whether or not we should be there. I don't think anyone out there is going to say, yes, I actually do advocate a totalitarian dictatorship. I think that's what we should have, right? We're all in agreement we don't want that. So it seems hard to me to imagine that anyone could be in disagreement that we're rapidly getting there if we're not like already fully there. Like, I think you might debate somewhere over here, but the trend is obvious, especially this year, and it's very concerning to me. This is the number one political issue in our country and in the world, especially in places like Australia and Great Britain and other countries where we don't really even know how bad this is, because who knows what's going on the ground in Bangladesh or in Sudan. Who knows how they're treating, what excuses they're using to roll out troops and to impose curfews and to lock people up for crimes that aren't crimes. Like, we don't know how bad it is elsewhere in the world, but we know what it's happening in the first world that we always thought was the land of the free. We see this tyranny taking over, and I guarantee you, folks, it's not going to stop because the people doing it just kind of say, oh, well, I guess we shouldn't. Like, we have to stop it. We have to stop it. And so what does that mean? Well, it means for people who don't know what it is, they need to do some research and they need to catch up a little bit and do their homework. If you have done that and you have some sense of this conspiracy against humanity, then the next step is, well, how do we do something about it? And that's the permaculture agorism conversation. That's the decentralized yet organized and effective resistance through clever means. We're not going to just go out and fight them head to head. We're not just going to charge into the trench like so many of our fallen brothers of this era did. Like, we should fight smarter than that. But we have solutions, and it really comes down to being politically active in a new way and not just getting behind candidates and sort of abandoning this whole idea of establishment politics. Let's do it the other way around. Instead of starting at the top and working our way down to where we are as individuals, let's start where we are as individuals. And let's make our politics be about our stance on the non-aggression principle, or about the idea of consent and individual sovereignty, bodily autonomy. We start with that, right? Like, if you're the type of person who believes that it's okay for you to pay people to come and rob me, then I need to know that when I meet you. And people think when they see someone of the opposite political party that that's how big of a difference it is. And in reality, they're all on that boat. They're all wanting to pay other people to come and harm their political opponents, right? To arrest them, to make laws that force them to do whatever they want, right? That's the sort of mentality. And I'm advocating, as are so many other people, that we need to create a new political identity that revolves around a belief in leaving people alone and not aggressing against them, not imposing harm against them, not trying to tell them what they have to do. Now, there's all sorts of other issues that get discussed later, but if we start with that, it's about a real basic thing that everyone should be able to philosophically agree to. And then, of course, the statists have to go through the painful process of undoing their programming so that they can understand how most of the political ideals that are common in the discussion are actually invalid, because the state doesn't have a right to do anything to you or to anyone. They don't have the right to tell anyone what to do. All they have the right to do is perform very specific and narrow functions that we as people commission them to and fund them to do, right? We're paying them to do jobs. We're not paying them to come up with more and more reasons to take our money, more and more ways to, more and more excuses to lock us in a cage, right? That's what politics has been for all this time. And even though you can find good things about each side and you can get behind those platforms because of that good rhetoric, you can look at the trend, you can look at history, and you can see that these politicians haven't been helping us and working for us. They're colluding with this process. They're helping make this possible. We need to fire them, and we need to only put people in positions that are supposed to be serving the public. We can only put people who are committed to these principles of non-aggression, non-subjugation, right? The concept of subjugation is really what this is. We are being subjugated, and we more or less have been, because, I mean, look at how many people you see going around listening to the government's mandates, right? During this whole, like, crisis this year. It showed me, it was a litmus test for who gets all of this and who understands what the totalitarian tiptoe is. Not enough people is what I saw. Not enough people. That's why I'm making this. That's why I'm coming at you more often, trying to just, get these things off my chest and have some dialogue. I'm looking forward to more interaction, more engagement, more people wanting to have roundtable conversations where we unwind all of this and we try and see what kind of peaceful transition can we have back to peace and freedom, as peaceful as possible. So that's all I got to say to you today. Hope y'all are doing well, and I'll be talking to you again real soon.